A primer on after-sales service. It is in the fixed operations, and that is the parts department, the service department, and a body shop where part of the overall dealership operating company where the dealership's after-sales service is delivered. In the typical dealership, somewhere around 70% of part sales are generated via service department repair orders. Clearly, a strong fixed operations, or more precisely, a strong and stable service department, is essential to parts department success. Historically, the automotive aftermarket was defined as the independent operators, and that means the warehouse distributors, the jobbers, the parts wholesalers, the general garages, the franchise shops that specialize in specific areas, while franchise dealer networks were seen as sort of islands unto themselves. That changed in the late 80s, largely as a result of seminal studies and research work by de Rosier Automotive Consultants. The key objective of this topic is to define the context or the setting in which the dealership's after-sales service business takes place, and that is the Canadian Automotive Aftermarket. So there are 5 core learning objectives, and let me briefly review them for this particular topic. Describe the scope and structure of the Canadian automotive aftermarket, and that's in the sense of the new definition that includes the dealership in the aftermarket. 2, identify the key issues affecting the delivery of after-sales service, key priorities and challenges the business faces today. 3, appraise the crucial role of fixed operations in dealership profitability. Few would argue today that the fixed operation is essential to stabilize dealership earnings and cash flow, and in fact as the major contributor to overall dealership profitability. And then 4 and 5 are kind of parallel topics. Examine the drivers of service excellence and customer satisfaction. It would seem obvious that the more satisfied the customers are, the more loyal or stable the customer base. That is in general terms true, but there's a very fragile link between customer satisfaction and customer loyalty, as we see from most recent research, and it's quite a skewed relationship that deserves some rigorous analysis to understand the framework. The dealership is in a unique position. As the source of new vehicle sales, it has the first call on building and maintaining a loyal customer base. And it is a loyal customer base that is the source of dealership profitability, but building it is also a major challenge. So to set the stage, let's look at some challenges, some of those challenges and the priorities that drives. And, there are 5. Again, a couple of them are parallel topics, but the first one is optimal profitability. I'll simply look at these challenges as a list at this point, and then add some specific operational issue explanations that I add its core in the next couple of slides. So optimal profitability, obviously optimal implies some type of trade-offs. It doesn't mean maximum, it doesn't mean utter responsiveness, but optimal means striking a balance between some critical factors. The second and third topic, excellence in customer service and building a loyal customer base, are those parallel topics I identified in learning objectives 4 and 5. They are the core to building that loyal customer base. Stable earnings and cash flow. In a hyper-competitive kind of automotive market that we see today, loyal customer base, high customer retention levels, giving customers compelling reasons to return to the dealership. That's what stabilizes earnings and cash flow, not just for fixed operations, for the dealership in general. And what are those challenges and priorities? And then capitalize on opportunities for growth. We've enjoyed record new vehicle sales over the last decade and a half. These units in operation that are out there today spell historically strong opportunities. And as this program and this course develops, we'll see what kinds of things help us to exploit these opportunities. So let's get more specific then. The first is optimal profitability. I talked about trade-offs, and here are the trade-offs between profitability, customer responsiveness, and competitiveness. Charging what the market will bear will clearly maximize profitability, at least in the short term. But it will do nothing to build that loyal customer base so essential to dealership stable earnings. So there are trade-offs to be responsive to customers, even when perhaps existing policies and procedures require you to go above and beyond normal limits. Second is effective working capital management. You'll hear much more about that as this course progresses, but inventory and inventory investment involves working capital. Inventory is working capital, and working capital has to be turned in order to optimize a return on investment. The more it turns, the higher the return on investment. Next is productive and efficient use of physical and human resources. Redundant assets, redundant space, excess or redundant support staff capacity clearly does nothing to optimize profitability. Balancing the revenue mix for the highest yield. Different accounts will yield different gross profit margins. And for example, wholesale part sales, discounted sales to the trade have typically lower gross profits. So what will be our optimal revenue mix? And finally, gross margin and expense management. Gross margin is a result of sales minus the cost of sales, or the gross profit divided by sales is the actual margin, but gross profit is sales minus cost of sales. And so clearly increasing sales or reducing cost of sales improve gross margin, and deducting expenses from the gross profit dollars will ultimately lead to net profit, or operating profit as it's more commonly called in most statements. Now, the next topic is customer service and customer loyalty. I'll deal with the second and third item in one slide here. Recognizing the dynamics of service quality. The word dynamics implies customer satisfaction and service quality is a moving target, or perceptions of service quality are a moving target. Evidence indicates the more dealers respond to customers and aim at exceeding their expectations, they raise the bar on expectations, and consequently the customer satisfaction resulting from meeting expectation is a moving target. The bar moves up. Rigid process control versus the need to customize, personalize, individualize. We'll see later in this discussion involved in this chapter that meeting customer expectations on the basics, and with that I mean things like fixing it right the first time, providing good value, etc., giving clear explanations of charges, etc., don't gain you many points with customers today. They expect that. They expect to be satisfied on those basic delivery processes. So rigid control is essential so you don't fail on those basics, but we know what customers reward with long-term loyalty is what industry analysts generally call positively memorable experiences, and they usually revolve around dealing with customers on their terms, and that means something like customizing, personalizing, and individualizing their experience. But that has these are two polarized extremes. On the one side, we ensure that everything is nailed down so we don't fail on the basics. On the other side, we are trying to respond to different kind of expectations or needs and requirements of individual customers. That's a major challenge today in customer service, frontline customer service particularly. meeting reasonable customer expectation. Obviously, the loaded term here is reasonable, and it is at the heart of trade-offs we just talked about. See, clearly what is reasonable is also a moving target if expectations or perceptions of satisfaction with a service experience are a moving target. So reasonable needs constant redefinition. It needs processes to understand how customers' expectations are changing, and then some responsive action to deal with those changing expectations. The fourth and the fifth item, speed, simplicity, convenience, openness, or transparency, some prefer to call that, are core expectations, and understanding the customer satisfaction link. We've already alluded to that. These two, I'll deal with it at some length later, because they're the core to understanding what generates customer retention and customer loyalty today. Now, finally, of the business challenges, priorities, financial stability and business growth. The first bullet you see here is fixed expense absorption. That is a measure of the ability of the fixed operations to cover, or the gross profit generated by the three fixed operations department, to cover the total expenses of the dealership. There's various guides out there, but they typically are something 70% or better of total expenses. That stabilizes overall dealership operation, because if the lion's share of the dealership's expenses are covered by fixed operation, that creates significant flexibility on the vehicle sales side. That's by definition more variable and cyclical to respond to market conditions. Second is stable business flow combined with optimal capacity control. Well, since 70% of parts and accessory sales come from service department repair orders, as I indicated at the outset, this will be heavily influenced by service operations. So for the parts department, clearly the service department or cooperation with the service department is essential to maximize its business potential. Management of capital investments. The fixed operations occupy a significant chunk of the dealership's property. They have some fairly expensive equipment. All of these require capital investments and capital outlays in order to build the service and parts delivery capability. Clearly, redundant assets don't do much for profitability. So managing of that capital investment and ensuring that indeed any investment generates a return on that investment is essential. Skillful marketing and merchandising strategies and tactics. Clearly, marketing is at the heart of achieving business potential. Today, there's a significant challenge for the dealers in retaining the business that traditionally hasn't been of great interest to them. Much of the business today is strictly sort of quote low margin kind of oil changes and minor services and that type of service mix. So skillful marketing and merchandising is essential to compete with an aftermarket that has had that particular aspect or mix of the service as one of its key strategic goals. So skillful marketing and merchandising strategy and tactics. Evaluating capacity expansion. Dealers today are under significant pressure by manufacturers to run state-of-the-art facility. This is at the heart of branding or brand management, and they include things like dealership re-imaging, meeting, corporate identification system kind of standards, etc. And that's one of the key reasons why we are seeing some consolidation and the formation of larger dealership groups with multiple franchises, because clearly that requires significant capital outlays that maybe to the individual single operator is harder to come by. Now, Let me move to the context now, the Canadian aftermarket. And there's a subheading here, the OES sector, parts and service market within the Canadian aftermarket. OES stands for Original Equipment Service, and that's the accepted definition today of dealership after sales service within the context of the Canadian aftermarket. So OES identifies the dealership. Now, let me start with a definition of the Canadian aftermarket. And comes from AIA, the Rosier. AIA is the Automobile Industries Association. That's the trade association formed by the traditional aftermarket players. And de Rosier does a lot of studies for them because he's kind of the major Canadian analyst of aftermarket issues. So the AIA, de Rosier definition is the automotive aftermarket is that part of the automobile industry concerned with the manufacturing, remanufacturing, distribution and retailing of all vehicle parts, tools, equipment, accessories, chemicals, and services. And then comes the qualifier, except those products that are used as original equipment in the manufacture of new vehicles. The highlighted areas, distribution, retailing of parts, accessories, chemicals, and services, which is the installed after service services provision, that's where the dealer tends to be most active. Manufacturers or the distributors can be in remanufacturing. Indeed, that's one of the major parts of the service business today, major assembly remanufacturing. But that is the standard definition of the automotive aftermarket and its competitive space. This definition has gone through a couple of refinements since first published by de Rosier, but this is the latest version, the current and generally accepted version. Now, this describes a lot of areas of the business, and to show you the complexity of that, let me show you this graph, which illustrates the complexity of the market in its abundance of interrelationships. You can see at the top parts manufacturers, rebuilders, parts suppliers, and then we see the manufacturers, agents, or national distributors. The parts manufacturers may be the vehicle manufacturer. They may be contract tier 1, tier 2 manufacturers. And manufacturers' agents may represent them and market to various parts of the aftermarket channels. And then there are three core channels. There's the original equipment service, that's the dealers, the vehicle companies, new and used car dealers, light truck dealers, heavy medium trucks, heavy medium duty truck dealers, agricultural equipment dealers, you can add recreational vehicles, motorcycles, that's all part of the aftermarket. Here in this context we are more concerned about with automobiles and the traditional dealer, so I'll limit myself in the discussion to that. Then next is the retail do-it-yourself channel, which may retail head offices, maybe like CarQuest, Napa, UAP, who sell to shoppers, and mass merchandisers, or myriad drug and food stores who may sell chemicals and oil and things like that, performance shops, auto wreckers, hardware stores, warehouse clubs, car dealers, any of those sell through these various channels. And on the right-hand side is the traditional aftermarket, which usually is identified as warehouse distributors, specialty warehouse distributors that maybe deal with specific narrow lines. They are buying groups, which are usually groups of member groups of wholesalers who join to pool their resources and effect improve their buying powers with part suppliers. And all of them support the wholesalers, independent installers, the department stores, the service stations, fleet shops, body shops, specialty installers, may distribute through wholesalers tied to the warehouse distributors or maybe through independent wholesalers or various jobbers, etc. And that ultimately reaches the consumers and fleets, whether the do-it-yourself and the dealers. They also also sell to the independent installers for those who want OEM parts. So clearly this is a tremendously complex market, and with many players, and each have their own niche and or their own specialization, and some defend those parts of the market more effectively than others. Now, what is the size of the Canadian aftermarket? And this here shows data from 1998 to 2013. This was from the 2012 AIA DeRosier Outlook study, and was the latest data available. The 2012 was still an estimate, and you can see that aftermarket represents currently around $20 billion of parts and labor final retail dollar sales in Canadian dollars. And this is using the SIC code market definition, and I want to make a specific point. The SIC code, which is the standard industrial classification code of defining specific market players, is used by DeRosier. The most current classification, since Canada is part of NAFTA, is the North American Industry Classification. And but it adds some things such as service stations, convenience store sales, which are mostly be pop and convenience foods and things like that. They are under NIAC considered part of the aftermarket, and clearly the purists therefore continue to prefer the SIC code market definition, and this is in the SIC code market definition. There's a couple of other bullet points to the right. 2004 to 2007 and 2009 will probably be historically high because of the high gas prices when oil prices rose to close to $150 per barrel. That reflected in gas prices, and you can see that reflected in some significant increases and percentage changes in the market. And gas prices are both positive or negative to the aftermarket. Positive because gasoline sales are revenue that is counted as part of aftermarket sales. So clearly that's why the percentage change was positive in those years. And they're negative to the extent that consumers usually tend to drive less when gas prices become reach a certain level. And secondly, evidence seems to indicate that consumers have kind of a finite budget on what they're prepared to spend to own and operate their vehicle. And when factors like insurance premiums and high gas prices squeeze those budgets, they simply stop doing certain services, and that has a downward effect on the aftermarket. Evidence indicates that indeed was experienced particularly after 2008 to 2009 financial turmoil. In fact, DeRosier has done a study of a demand study, as he called it, for the AIA, and that suggests that about $10 billion of required service as per manufacturer suggests that maintenance intervals is actually not being done these days because of potentially that budget effect on consumers. So it's clearly a critical area. Note that the mid to late 90s were a tough period for the aftermarket, which resulted in major consolidation in all sectors. And we can see here that's reflected in 1998, towards the end of that range of years that I just talked about. The aftermarket actually dropped, which is, as far as I know, the only time where the market actually didn't grow. So it was a tough period, and I'll come back to that in a moment, what that seemed to generate, what kind of strategic moves this generated. Now, this breaks the aftermarket into sectors, and the parts market, and that is do-it-yourself, it's identified here. The do-it-yourself market is declining. And that's probably driven, it certainly declined from 1994. There was a blip up again in 2008 to 2010, perhaps reflected again in in the tough economic period that we had, but also perhaps with the increase in the age of the vehicle fleet on the road. Vehicles last much longer, and higher age vehicles have more do-it-yourself, clearly, because the customer's focus shifts from preserving the value of your investment to just keeping it running for another couple of years, and that tends to encourage do-it-yourself work. You see, the parts market installed, that's the do-it-for-me kind of business, has stayed fairly stable. Now, the repair mix, or the repair versus service and maintenance mix, has fundamentally changed since the late 90s to where we see today in most franchises 70% plus of the dealership's service revenue comes from maintenance. And that's the installed parts market, but maintenance and sort of normally scheduled services, because of the quality of today's vehicles, is clearly not as parts intensive as the traditional business that had a high share of major repairs. The installed market has stayed fairly stable as a result, while the do-it-yourself market declined to shift to installed labor. And installed labor is somebody doing the repair, do it for me, as it tends to be identified. Now, I've talked a moment ago that there was the mid to late 90s were a tough period in the aftermarket. So let me add some explanation to that. And this starts at 1995 to 2011. I think it comes from the 2012 Outlook study again. In the latter half of the 90s, you can see here real, and I mean with real, after inflation price changes were negative. And see here, inflation in the mid to late 90s, early 2000s was around usually hovering between 2 to 3%. Bank of Canada's target is about 2%, but you see the total parts price increases, and labor was the mostly affected here. Parts was the most affected here. I'm sorry. Labor has stayed above zero, but here we actually had some drops. You see 1.6, 1.1, so that's clearly below inflation, and it only in 2001 did it start recovering again. These kind of real price changes were the negative and the major reason for the widespread consolidation in the aftermarket supply chain that we saw during that period. Let me use some examples. Napa buying UAP. Uniselect is a major consolidator. CarQuest is strong in central Canada and the east is a major consolidator. Lordco is a major consolidator in the two westernmost provinces. Modern Sales, which is a buying group based in Barrie, by the way. It has 300 plus wholesaler members who, as I indicated, pool their buying power to stay competitive in the business. So pricing power recovered after this consolidation, and we see that here from 2001 on 2009, 2010. That's again probably a reflection of the tough period of the recession, of the Great Recession, I guess, as it was called. Now, let me define the market in terms of who are the channel players in this market. And I'll start off with the observation that a market is defined by how willing buyers and willing sellers interact, not by some marketer's idea of let me call this a market. And I guess we learned that profoundly in this century, after the turn of the century. This was during the dot-com boom. Just because I decide to build some capability doesn't mean they will come. It is therefore essential, if it's willing buyers and willing sellers interacting, it's therefore essential to understand how the after-sales service customer buys services. And this is the the generally accepted decision tree for required vehicle repairs. And this tool was developed by de Rosier. It did most of the groundbreaking work in aftermarket studies. First, there is a service incidence, and I guess the customer needs to decide at that point, is this something I can live with and just ignore, or will I actually do the repair? That would be the first choice. To just ignore it is more common with older vehicles because, well, I can live with that. It's got to last for another couple of years. So if I decide that a repair is necessary, the first decision alternative is this something I can do myself? Do it yourself, DIY, or this is too complicated, I have to have someone do it for me. That's the DIFM abbreviation here. If I decide I need somebody to install that for me, it's beyond my capability, I have two choices again. One is original equipment service, as we defined it earlier. That is, do I take it to the dealer? Is this something that needs the expertise and the focus on my brand that the dealer can provide and factory-trained technicians, etc.? Or do I take it to the traditional aftermarket, perhaps because I'm looking for a better price? And then the traditional aftermarket too has some alternatives. There are general installers or general garages. There's some highly specialized installers, franchises that focus on narrow parts of the business. So that then means that there are three main channels as highlighted here in color. The do-it-yourself channel, the original equipment channel, and the traditional aftermarket channel. And the traditional aftermarket channel has some alternatives here. But the three channels are do-it-yourself, original equipment service, and the traditional aftermarket. Now, who is, let's look first, the do-it-yourself is over-the-counter kind of part sales by dealers or by wholesalers, etc. But let's look at the alternative of do-it-for-me, the installed market. Who makes up the installed market of the business? This here is a study, it's some years old, it's the latest AIA study available of Canada's automotive service providers. It identified at that point, I believe it was in 2008 when it was done, about 38,000 automotive service providers in the following categories. You can see independent garages represented almost half of the 38,000 service providers. Next are the franchise and corporate chains. They might be Midas and Amco and etc., although they may partially also feed into the specialty chain. But franchise and corporate chains are finding today that with the growing quality of vehicles and the long-term reliability that we see today, that very narrow business models that focus on highly specialized areas are a threatened species. You need to broaden your capability in order to have still a viable business model. Then the independent tire shops, they may be the Cal Tires, the Okanagan Tires, the Active Green and Ross, etc., and maybe some of the tire shops that are linked to tire manufacturers. There's big box retail, and the three mass merchandisers that are still involved in that is certainly predominantly Canadian Tire. Costco is largely in tire sales and areas like that, less in service, and Walmart has some service capability. Then there are the car dealerships, 12% of the total. There's somewhere between 36 and 3,700 car dealerships in Canada for all franchises. There are Quick Loops, 1% of the 38,000. There's specialty chains, and specialty chains may be highly specialized areas that I'll see in a couple of slides that probably today are too narrow. Their business model is too narrow. And then PBE stands for paint, body, and equipment. 19% just under 8,000 body shops and collision repair shops in Canada, some of them affiliated in franchises, others the corner in independent body shops. And then there are warehouse distributor banners, and I guess the most prominent of those is Napa's AutoPro, which is a very powerful banner that signs up independent garages and supports them with high levels of marketing and business and technical support. In fact, AutoPro has led the customer satisfaction rating in the J.D. Power Customer Commitment Index study. So this is a broad overview and a breakdown of the business. Now let's look at the respective market shares that they have accomplished, and it's broken into two categories here, in the two categories of installed market shares, which we called the DIFM earlier as an abbreviation, and the DIY, do-it-yourself market share from 2000 to 2008. It's reported somewhat differently today, and an additional observation is that the survey methodology changed in 2004. That changed also how certain categories were bundled, and that comparisons with earlier data probably needs to be made with caution. But here is the trend. You can see new car dealers had 35.8% of the overall aftermarket to a high of 37.2 in 2001, and that is a result of a major emphasis by dealers in the mid-90s as service mix shifted more to service and maintenance, saying, being a warranty service station is no longer a viable fixed operation strategy. We need to go after all of the business that's out there. So they went very aggressively after the business with value-priced, menu-priced bundling of those typical low-margin services, and that's clearly reflected in the significant increase in market penetration. And then it started falling. 2002 was a significant drop, 36, 34, 33, 32, 28. It dropped in 2009 to 27.2. but has since, as I'll show you in the next slide, recovered again to 30.7. And this is traditionally what we see. The traditional aftermarket, after that consolidation and the dealers' penetration of the market, has regrouped and said, how do we essentially need to compete in that area? And that's reflected in this area. So the general garages have taken some of this business, and they may be general garages affiliated with warehouse distributor banners. In fact, most of them would be, that have led to this increase. So 32, 33, 35, 35, 38, 42, 39, 38. And the specialists, I said earlier, they're kind of a threatened species because highly specialized kind of franchises or individual shops is usually too narrow a business model. You can see that's reflected in the gradual loss of market share. And others, including Canadian Tire, is probably dominated by Canadian Tire here, and that's also a significant increase because Canadian Tire in about 2008 or maybe 2006, starting in 2006, refocused its business on aftermarket services as opposed to just retailing, because their share of the installed market had started to erode a bit, and that clearly has worked. In a do-it-yourself market share, you see here around 6% is fairly typical. The auto parts stores have lost some of that business, and that was taken over by the warehouse distributors and perhaps by the mass merchandisers who have increased from 64 to 68%. Okay, now I'll show you some later data because I said it's reported differently now. This is DIFM channel share from 2004 to 2010 in 2-year intervals. And new car dealers, this shows the erosion and the recovery in 2010 again. The general garages got a big chunk of that business that the dealers were losing, and particularly 2006 and 2008 they dropped again, and you see the other, and that probably reflects Canadian Tire's new strategic shift to the aftermarket that also affected the generalists, but they've recovered slightly. The specialists have dropped significantly, but many of them are today no longer Midas Muffler. They're Midas Muffler, Shocks, Vehicle Service, after maintenance services, and that kind of broadening of the business model apparently is starting to show some results. Now, the specialists, think of maybe Mr. Radman, that I'm not sure if it's still there as a franchise. That's the kind of highly specialized service that's clearly under threat. Now, we show you the update also from 2004 to 2010 for the DIY channel, and point you to one specific category here of other, including Canadian Tire. Canadian Tire, and this is the progressive increase in the other category, also not just in installed business but also in DIY. Canadian Tire alone holds 52.3% of those 73.6% purple bar that is the 2010 bar in the other category. So 52.3 divided by multiplied by 73.6 is about somewhere between 35 to 40% of the total DIY market in Canada. Some earlier studies that are not as up to date as this seem to indicate that much of that business at Canadian Tire, when you look at the breakdown of what they sell, tends to be lubricants, chemicals, oils, coolant top-ups, and wiper blades, taillight lamps, and belts, and the kind of consumable items that probably lend themselves to do-it-yourself work for even those that are not necessarily that highly technical. Okay, auto parts stores, you can see they progressively lost market share. It seems to sort of parallel the pattern of the new car dealers, and then recovered slightly in 2010. Same pattern is visible among the dealers, and the generalists and the specialists seem to be the ones that this share gained by the auto parts stores and new car dealers is shifting to. Now, Canada is a country of regions, and this is something particularly U.S. aftermarket players have learned to their surprise when they moved into Canada, that one size tends not to fit all in Canada because there are very different patterns in different regions of the country. And I won't look at each of these numbers in detail, but just to illustrate, for example, Quebec, the new car dealers and the independent repair shops have almost 2/3 of the business. The other players are significantly smaller. Canadian Tire, because that's where it's headquartered and where it originates, has the biggest share in Ontario, and some of the other things in Quebec are marginal. In BC, the new car dealers have only 19.2% of the business, and auto parts stores 14.4, significantly higher than anywhere in the country. BC has the highest do-it-yourself market in the country, and if you're looking for some reasons for that, I'm not sure that they are absolutely statistically valid, but I understand that in the greater Vancouver area new car dealers, many of them have retail labor rates of $200 and above. Well, that would certainly appear to me to be one reason why there's a high do-it-yourself. So anyway, outlet shares across the country are significantly different, markedly different channel shares, and that has implications on the kind of focus of regional and geographic and regional strategies. Now it gets interesting. Distribution of repair work by channel. And this is again from some of this research is not done anymore in the last few years, so I had to tap into earlier research, and this is the dealers, and this is total work, not just do-it-yourself. This is installed and do-it-yourself work. This is the aftermarket. I was surprised to see this because the dealer starts basically with automatic built-in retention. But anyway, let me demonstrate it, and I'll come with some later data in a moment from the ROSI study. And graphically, this here are numbers, but you can see the dealers' market share erodes rapidly as the vehicle gets older. So by vehicle age, the dealer has retention in the first 5-6 years, or significant retention in the 5-6 years of ownership, and then gradually the aftermarket takes over to about 12-13 years. Then the aftermarket starts fading, and the do-it-yourself market increases. And certainly we see that today, that the do-it-yourself market is too a bit threatened because the sheer complexity of automobiles makes it difficult even to the die-hard sort of backyard mechanic to do some of the repairs that traditionally were done by amateurs. I'm told by distributors or warehouse distributors or wholesalers such as Part Source, for example, who focus on the serious do-it-yourselfer, that much of the do-it-yourself work still left today is largely done by professional technicians that are moonlighting. So that's the pattern in numbers, in percent of penetration. This here is graphically, and this comes from the 2012 AIA DeRossi Aftermarket Outlook study. And it illustrates the challenge of the dealerships. I said earlier that the dealers, because they control new vehicle sales, are kind of in the power position, and they also have a captive market, or largely captive market at least, for all the repair business other than routine services during the terms of the vehicle warranty. The typical vehicle warranty would be the basic warranty, 3 years, 60,000 kilometers, maybe 80,000 kilometers, and major components and powertrain warranties, maybe 5 years, 800,000, or some maybe 120 and 140. But anyway, 3 to 5 years seem to be, in terms of vehicle age, a significant breaking point. And for the dealer, apparently, once the vehicle warranty is gone, so are most of its customers. And that's the biggest challenge of the dealer, to retain the customer in the longer term, and that has implications, as I'll particularly highlight in the next slide. So let me leave that particular part and say who clearly gets the business that the dealers are losing is largely the aftermarket, the traditional aftermarket, to about 11-12 years of age, and then the aftermarket slope declines somewhat, although it still increases, but it's a somewhat flatter slope, and the do-it-yourself market increases. Okay, now here is why this erosion of the dealer's market share is so critical. This is average cost of vehicle repair for personal use only vehicles. And you can see how it's changed. As vehicles get older and improve quality, more and more of the real serious work, where the real money gets spent on the vehicles, have shifted, as at 2009 here, to 8 to 15-year-old vehicles. Yet, this is exactly the period 8 to 15-year-old vehicles where the dealer loses most of the market share. So clearly that is a challenge, a critical challenge to be solved by dealers, and we see different manufacturers make different attempts to market directly to the owner of older vehicles, because it is clearly critical in the long term to getting the business that is out there in the serious repair business. Now, let me move on to a different topic, and that is parts and service management in general terms in the aftermarket, an overview of distinctive competencies and critical success factors. This is terminology that comes from strategic management, and strategic management, one of the core techniques to analyze industries and businesses in the industry, is a so-called SWOT analysis, a strategic analysis, strengths and weaknesses, which are usually identifying distinctive competencies, and opportunities and threats which are out there in the market that should drive our strategy, and they usually are given a label of critical success factors. So from the strategic management perspective, the OES channel's position in the aftermarket determines its critical success factor, and as we just identified, one of the biggest challenges to be solved is returning the customer of older vehicles. We'll talk more about those critical success factors in this course and in the service management course that is also part of this program. So for now, let me just talk about distinctive competencies, the capability that the dealership itself needs to bring to the market to excel. So from the operational perspective, this and the next slide chart the major steps in both the service service cycle, as it's headlined here, and the parts order cycle, and they demand leading edge capabilities, and the leading edge capabilities are those fixed operations distinctive competencies that most franchisors try to develop for a dealer to succeed in this today relentlessly competitive and unforgiving marketplace. I won't spend a lot of time on that because that's the core of a future course, but let me just highlight some of the steps involved here. Handling appointments. Today, many dealers are highly specialized and accordingly staff their service department with the kind of skill sets to allow them to specialize. So that means in handling appointments, it's critical criteria to make sure that appointments are booked and flow into the service department to make sure that those specialized technicians are kept busy constantly with billable work. So handling appointments, meeting, greeting and repair order write-up, service selling and merchandising, estimating and service diagnosis, they're the service reception process. And this is where much of the service experience and the kind of efforts that create compelling reasons to continue to deal with the same aftermarket service provider, and that's really where those perceptions are shaped. Then the next 4 steps: scheduling work for completion, monitoring work progress, keeping the customer informed of changes. Maybe there's some additional work needed, or we have to keep it overnight because we need to special order part come in and we'll give you something to drive, these kind of things. And inspecting work quality, that's the production management, the repair and quality control after the repair. And then finally, delivery to customer. That's the last opportunity to, or moment of truth, if I may call it that shapes the experience for this particular service visit. And then after service follow-up, usually focused on ensuring that the customer is satisfied and all issues are resolved as expected. Now, the next cycle is the parts order cycle, and that's on the parts operation side, and we'll talk much more about that as this course evolves. Let me first explain the steps. It starts at the top with a part is sold or a lost sale. That is a demand. A lost sale is a demand that I could not fill clearly, but had I had the part, I probably would have had a sale. So it's a demand on the inventory and should drive decisions on what should I ultimately stock. Then that demand is input into the inventory control system. As the parts invoice is generated, that inputs the demand. That sale in inventory control reduces the quantity on hand. Lost sale is logged into a lost sale category in DMS, the dealer management system, and that tracks potential sales patterns and demand patterns to see if this is perhaps a part I should be stocking. The system then calculates the stock order, and the stock order is input by whatever means, whether it's input directly in a dealership in the manufacturer's portal, or whether it's submitted by some other means. It depends on the franchise. Today, predominantly, dealers have access directly to manufacturers' portals, where they even in some franchises can see live what the parts distribution center has in stock to come to some conclusion this is something that will be delivered overnight, for example. Order received at the parts distribution center. The order is shipped. It's received at the dealership, and that is from the order entry to the receipt of the part. That's the classic shipment lead time. The part at that point, if it's received at the dealership, is not necessarily for sale, particularly in a large dealership where parts come in and out constantly. It has to be first put on the shelf, that's put the part in stock, and then record receipt of the part in the DMS, and then only is it to the viewer that brings up the screen to say, do we have this part, then it is available for sale. Each of these steps takes time. This is the reason we need parts inventory. And depending on the manufacturer's order system and the sophistication of the supply chain, order lead times will vary accordingly. Today there are two core systems, and there are more systems, some automatic replenishment systems, but so the weekly stock order to an open daily order, just-in-time order, there's clearly different lead times. If I'm in a weekly stock order system and I have 1 day a week as my assigned day to submit stock orders, then I clearly have more lead time than when I can submit orders on an ongoing basis, and they're supplied next day or overnight through a contract carrier. So that's the parts order cycle. Now, we get again to a different topic. Parts and service management, the changing contribution of the after-sales business to overall dealership profitability. It's particularly instructive to look at that. For a historical perspective, I needed to tap into NADA data. I'll show you that in a moment. The CADA does not have a dedicated research capability, and so Canadian long-term data is in short supply. It became more detailed when de Rosier started doing a lot of aftermarket studies, and that didn't happen until the mid to late 80s. I'll start with NADA data of parts departmental sales as a percent of the total, and this comes from the NADA data site. This was 2013. It was received for updates. You can go to nada.org and get NADA data that's the more current year, whatever is available. But these were departmental sales as a percent of the total in the US in 2011. New car sales represented 54.4% of total sales, used car sales 32.4%, and parts and service 13.2%. This is the proportion of revenue generated by these three categories of parts and service are clearly bundled here. New and used car sales include finance and insurance, etc. Now, compare US data with Canadian data with caution. The typical multi-franchise dealer of the US tends to have synergies that are in the Canadian largely exclusive franchise setting harder to achieve, and I'll just make that point. But for purpose of comparison and how the overall contribution to dealership profitability has changed, this is still a valid proxy. Now, these are sales. So 54.4, 13.2, 32.4. This in the late 70s, and I'll show you the late 70s, and that's the historical data that I couldn't find for Canada. New car sales contributed 74% of the profit contribution, and its net profit contribution. NADA statistical base reports departmental profit contribution as net profit. The available Canadian de Rosier data reports it as gross profit, and in my view probably more appropriate, because after gross profit you deduct expenses to come to net profit, and many of these expenses are often the result of tax planning strategies or allocated, etc. So gross profit is a more valid comparison of the direct contribution, but NADA reports it as net profit. So 74% for new car sales, 2% for parts and service, 25% for used car sales. I was out in the field in the 70s as a district service manager, and many of the dealers I used to visit had the attitude that parts and service is kind of a necessary evil. You have to have it to be a full full service dealer, but it really isn't a moneymaker. Well, let me see how that has dramatically changed. This is 2011. And I must probably qualify that 2011, in particularly in the U.S., it was still a tough market as the auto industry was still recovering from the GM Chrysler bankruptcies and the fallout from what's been has come to be called the Great Recession. So it's maybe not necessarily an absolutely representative year, but that was available at the time this was developed. Remember, 74% was new vehicle sales. It's now 74.5% parts and service. New vehicle sales only contributed 2% to net profit. Used vehicle sales 23%. So that's reflective of a very tight market where new vehicle sales are at best break even, and it depends on the power of the franchise and the brand image of the franchise and how hot the product is on what you see in new vehicle sales. But clearly, as an overall market, this makes a dramatic statement how much more important parts and service has become to the survival of the average dealership. Now, that's the US data. Now let me come to Canada, and these are sales also in 2011, and that comes from the DeRosier Annual Yearbook, and you see the new vehicle sales here 69.4%, and used new vehicle sales in 2011 in the US were 54.4%. That is partially driven by new vehicle sales in the US probably still suffering from the tight market, and Canada didn't have as strong a recession as the US, but certainly new car sales are much more important in the Canadian market as they were in the US at the time. Used car sales 19.1 in the US, and that's the sales as a percent of total. Okay, it was 19.1 and 32.4 in the US. So clearly Canadian dealers are not anywhere as aggressively in the used car market as the US dealers are. And then finally parts and service 11.5, it was 13.2. So that's about in the ballpark. But certainly new car sales and used car sales are dramatically different in Canada. Now I said the Canadian data is reported as gross profit, not as net profit. Here is the gross profit contribution to overall dealership gross profit by department and by specific areas in the departments, and that's the contribution to profit. And you can see some interesting trends here. New vehicles started fading during the Great Recession, but held fairly stable, and certainly by 2011 had become the major contributor here. Used vehicle sales were 12.6, 12.5, 13.5, so between 12 to a high of 13.5, so relatively stable. There hasn't been that much change. Service department 31.6, 31.6, 30, 31.7, 32, 30, 27.9. That reflects partially the erosion in the market and partially the shifting revenue mix in service departments to more maintenance and smaller services than traditionally more prevalent major repairs. And then repair parts wholesale 1.6%, usually about 16 to 18% of total parts department sales, but a smaller contributor to overall profitability because they tend to be discounted sales. Accessories, tuners, collision repairs, that's the overall market. And collision repairs, wholesale parts, and then you can see here insurance, the F&I, finance and insurance kind of contributions, 0.73, 0.79, 0.8, insurance, warranty, and others, and that's extended service contract warranty in that context. That's the gross profit contribution. Now let's look at some trends of gross profit margins. In other words, gross profit percent produced by those sales. And see, new vehicles fairly stable. During the tough market, during the Great Recession, it was tighter, but 9.5 and 9.4. So the gross profit margins had some fluctuation, fairly stable. Used vehicle, probably more stable than new vehicle, and a dealership with a good used car operation can be very, very profitable. Service 70, 69, 68, 67, 71, 72. You can see it faded until 2009. 2010 the market penetration increased, and that's a reflection of the dealers aggressively going after the maintenance business that now represents for many 70% plus of the service mix. And what probably is reflected here in gross profit margin, if 70+% of your service business is maintenance, you don't need a shop full of A-class technicians that are paid $25 an hour or whatever, maybe more with benefits and to other associated costs. So more and more dealers have reduced their labor costs by saying we need unlicensed lube people, or utility men, as some like to call them, to reduce our average labor cost, and that seems to be reflected in the recovery of gross profit margins. Repair parts wholesale surprises me a little. That's in 35% range, because that is largely discounted sales, yet the Detroit 3 dealers usually have very lucrative wholesale compensation programs, and that may be reflected there, that their wholesale business is much more profitable. Accessories, tuners, the kind of specialty parts can certainly be a significant contributor to profitability. Collision repair is kind of a threatened business today, because the major customer for most collision repair shops is insurance companies, and they put tremendous pressure on the shops to reduce cost and reduce prices. And that same is reflected in the parts, although that's been fairly stable. Lease, financing, loan financing, insurance, while they were a small contributor to overall profitability, they're a tremendously profitable business, and that's clearly emphasizes the attractiveness of the F&I offerings, contributing to overall dealership profitability. So the weighted total overall gross margin for total dealership is around 16 to high 17.7 to 16.4. So it's eroding somewhat, but it's not a dramatic change. Now, let me wrap up this discussion with this topic of after-sales service quality and customer satisfaction. The ownership experience is fundamentally shaped by the customer's after-sales experience. So let's set the stage with a discussion of some of those fundamentals. And I'll start off with saying it would seem to be intuitively obvious that a satisfied customer is a loyal customer. Unfortunately, as we'll see in a moment, it is not as simple as that. Let me start with this factors shaping the ownership experience. There are 4 factors or elements that shape the customer's ownership experience. At the heart of it, and if you look at these rectangles that are represented here, the larger the rectangle, the more organizational effort is expended at that particular area to be affecting the ownership experience. At the heart is the basic product or service. That's the vehicle, styling, function, technology, reliability, durability, and that's largely the realm of the manufacturer. The next one is basic support system, the next bigger rectangle. Basic support system in the franchise dealer setting is the dealer network, geographic representation, the sophistication of the dealer facilities, the technical capabilities, factory training, parts availability, all the things that shape the customer's experience in either being prompt, efficient, and professional service, or something less than that if some elements are lacking. And next rectangle on the left is extraordinary services. So some call them enhanced services, and they're the kinds of things that differentiate the dealer from other dealers by some unique services that dealer might offer. Okay, and then there is the recovery process to the right. You can see that's connected to basic product or service and the basic support system. And there's a reason for that. The recovery process is the dealer's ability, or the service department's or whatever department's ability, to recover customer goodwill when something has gone wrong. Things can and will go wrong, and how good are we at retaining the customer and giving the customer the impression that we continue to be good, effective people to deal with. So you see, they're connected to the recovery process is connected to the basics, and that's for a very specific reason. There's a broad consensus today that being an effective performer on the basics, to have a product that works, that is reliable, that meets sort of expectations of current technology and features and functions, etc., and having a dealer network, a basic support system that works and is capable of delivering professional ownership support, that is the price of admission of being a serious contender. In other words, you don't get any points from the customer for that anymore. It's simply, well, yeah, I expect that. So if this is basic expectation, the basic support system and the basic product, really all you have left then to differentiate yourself and providing the customer with a compelling reason to continue to deal with that is your ability to deliver extraordinary services and the recovery process. Now, let me just talk a little about those extraordinary services, because they're increasingly difficult to define what that is today. When dealers have extraordinary, let me use that word again, support services like loaner cars, rental cars, customer loyalty management systems, discounts for different classes of customers, free car washing, free detailing perhaps for major services, etc., etc., etc. What the heck is extraordinary in today's world? And that's clearly an issue that many dealer principals that I've spoken to have sometimes articulated. Well, we keep doing things, and what the heck is it that we can continue to do to make the customer experience something unique? And I have cutely defined, and probably cutely is a good term, extraordinary services, that these kind of things that elevate the customer's experience with a service provider from saying, well, they're good, solid people to deal with, to, wow, they really take care of their customers. They're by definition extraordinary extras, enhanced extras that aim at exceeding customer expectations, that give that compelling reason and create those positively memorable experiences. And then the recovery process we've already talked about. Now, let me show you something particularly about service recovery, because there's a lot of research being done on that, because it's one of the core differentiators. And here's where it gets interesting. This is data from TARP, Technical Assistance Research Programs. It's a Boston, Massachusetts-based, North America-wide service research organization with a huge database of service experiences. And this first bar charts is about what they gave the title of Market Damage Study. The impact on this first slide, and there's one to follow, the impact of problems on loyalty. And they looked at 6 industries here. And you can see, if you observe the industry categories, automotive services, financial services, packaged goods, high-tech equipment, telephone services, utilities. As we move from left to right, we come here from a highly fragmented, certainly powerfully competitive market, to the right-hand side, which sort of approaches the monopoly stage. Well, certainly oligopoly, where only a few suppliers are potentially available to even utilities, and in many areas are monopolies. So the research was really focused on the following thing. Is there a significant difference in a problem, the impact of a problem, depending on the competitiveness of the industry? That's why these 6 industries were looked at. And you see the bluish bar there, loyalty before having a problem, and the black bar, loyalty after having a problem. See, the automobile service started with 87%. Automobile purchase is a careful purchase and tends to, once the customer is satisfied, this is the vehicle to buy, it tends to have lead to a high level of satisfaction. But, and this is important, that black bar after having a problem. After that careful evaluation and making the purchase decision, now I'm having a problem. I'm really disappointed about that. I didn't expect that, and loyalty drops by the most of any of these industries. 37 percentage points in automotive, 30 percentage points for packaged and high tech, less than in the other groups. Okay? This is impact of a problem. Now, they took it further from that data and said, well, what happens if you kick into the service recovery mode and you deliver recovery at varying levels of effectiveness? And this is this slide. It's narrowed down to the four industry categories: automotive service, financial services, packaged goods, and high-tech equipment. And that was because they had only enough data for these four industries to be satisfied that the analysis would be statistically valid. But that tells a much more compelling story. And see, the black bar, satisfied customers. In other words, I kicked into recovery. I handled it professionally with a minimum of inconvenience and to all intents and purposes satisfied the customer. The bluish bar is I mollified the complainant, and mollified dictionary definition could be appease, make it go away kind of thing. So mollified the customer, and the white bar is I did kick into the recovery mode and they remained dissatisfied, the customer. Now, I make the first point. The satisfied complainant, yes, that says satisfaction can be recovered by an effective recovery process, but contrary to high-tech and packaged goods industry, something is permanently lost in automotive service. Remember, let me flick back to the previous slide. Remember, we were at 87 before we had a problem. Now we've fixed the problem to all intents and purposes professionally, and we regained satisfaction, expressed that intention to continue to deal with you again, to buy from you again. It only rose to 71%. So 16% were permanently lost. The second bar, and that's also tremendously enlightening, after we had a problem and before we did anything, retail repurchasing intentions were 50%. Now we did something, but sort of just appeased the customer. It didn't really gain as much. It just returned to 54%. And the third one is the even more compelling and profound. I kicked into the recovery mode, but didn't manage to fix it. Now I have dissatisfied the customer not just once, but twice, and repurchase intention and loyalty drops off the table. So the lesson in that is, if you kick into recovery, make sure you can fix it. If it's questionable that there's something you can do about a driving condition or some feature of the car the customer is dissatisfied with, you are better off explaining that this is the way it works than taking it in and therefore admitting that you think something can be done about it and then ending up not being able to make any change, because then loyalty just absolutely falls apart. Okay. Now, there's an interesting aside to that. Packaged goods and high-tech equipment. Let me again come to the previous slide in a moment. Satisfied complainants, 94% and 90% after satisfying them in all respects. Well, they were at 83 and 83, both of them at 83. In fact, satisfaction increased after I satisfied the complainant. And that's actually what we traditionally used to believe also in the auto industry. If you do have a problem and you kick into the recovery, that gives you an opportunity to demonstrate to the customer your level of professionalism, how you care for the business, and if you do it well, loyalty will actually be enhanced, it will not deteriorate. Well, apparently this is no longer the case according to this research. Okay. Now, why is that? Let me show you the next slide here, and there's a graphic here that I'll explain in a moment. Let me deal with the formula that's in the bottom first. This is about the imperative of truly outstanding service. This equation, satisfaction equals performance minus expectations, has been a fixture of the automobile industry for many years. That's the foundation of customer satisfaction ranking systems. What it says is, if my performance meets customer expectations in all respects, satisfaction doesn't change. It's at best neutral. Okay, and that's what I said earlier on the basics, where basic expectations are those things: fix it right the first time, good value, explanation of charges that everybody delivers. Well, so what? That doesn't everybody is the reaction to that. Satisfaction is neutral at that point. So now we see why I earlier said satisfaction is a moving target, and expectations are a moving target. As dealers focused on improving the customer experience and therefore satisfaction levels, they aimed their performance at above expectations. And over time, doing that raised the bar on expectations, because customers came to expect those high levels of service because they saw them with other service providers, they saw them with the dealership. Well, that's part of the normal service delivery. That's the reason why satisfaction has become such a moving target. Now, let me come to the graphic that really illustrates the imperative of truly outstanding service. You see two charts here. The horizontal scale is 1 to 5, and that's expressed as CSI, as satisfaction, customer satisfaction index numbers. And this, by the way, came from J.D. Power Research. At the time, and this is some historic data, at the time it was a 5-point scale, J.D. Power. Now it's a 10-point scale. And in this case, 1 was unsatisfactory, 2 was fair, 3 was good, 4 was excellent, 5 was truly outstanding. And the vertical bar here is loyalty, and that's usually expressed as something like percent of customer retention. Now, we used to believe, and I spent many years in the wholesale side of the industry, we used to believe there is something resembling a linear relationship between customer satisfaction and customer loyalty. And what that belief essentially drove in terms of strategy is saying, well, then let's focus on managing up the average of customer satisfaction in our network amongst our dealers, and then loyalty should rise correspondingly, or customer retention should rise correspondingly. I show it here as a 45-degree line. It probably never was that. It's probably something much flatter than that, even in those days when we believed that. But anyway, we believed it was something like a linear relationship. This belief was utterly debunked by a very detailed study that was reported in, I think, at this November-December 2006 Harvard Business Review article, where two Harvard University professors studied the industry, again with the same kind of perspective than this TARP study. Let's look at the level of competitiveness of the industry and see how that affects customer satisfaction and long-term loyalty. And they came to the conclusion that in highly fragmented industry, where there is an abundance of choice, anything less than consistently truly outstanding truly outstanding performance, I should say, puts customers at risk. In fact, ultimately, they concluded that in the automotive industry, which was one of the most perfectly competitive industries or fragmented industries in their study base, it looks something like this. In other words, it meant that if the customer rates the experience, and this was the actual report result, rates the experience at 4. And remember that label, that's excellent. The customer is 6 times as likely to defect as a customer rating the experience at 5. And that is truly outstanding. So what that in essence says, and what the customers are telling us here, look, I expect to be satisfied, but if you want my business in the long term, nothing less than consistently, truly outstanding service will get you that. So there's a tremendously fragile and skewed relationship today between customer satisfaction and customer loyalty. And that's, as we know now from the research, that is the new highly competitive kind of industries that we have. The automotive customer is a tremendously unforgiving customer. Now, I'll come to the latest research that I could find, and that is from the J.D. Power Customer Commitment Index study. And that shows here, and now J.D. Power ranks the choices on their survey forms from 10, which is truly outstanding, to 1, which is unsatisfactory, and the labels, it's no longer labels, it's simply a ranking. So truly outstanding, and this here 9 approaches truly outstanding, and 8 is certainly between excellent and truly outstanding, and this year 7 down to 1, which is clearly less than satisfactory. So the vertical bar here, or the vertical scale, is percent definitely will return for customer pay work, and this is a customer commitment study that's done with both OES brands and aftermarket brands, and it's quite extensive, about 35 different brands that it looks at. Customer commitment index study. Okay, now a customer that ranks the experience at 10, truly outstanding, 96% of them say, I will definitely return for customer pay work. It already drops to 81%, which is close to truly outstanding, but already something is lost. At 8, which is somewhere between excellent and truly outstanding in label definitions, it drops to half. So J.D. Power essentially concludes that only the customer rating at 10 is loyal, and that's what we've seen in the previous graph of the imperative of truly outstanding service. So only the customer rating 10 is outstanding. Anything less than 10, 9 and 8 is already at risk, certainly 8 significantly at risk, and anything less than 7 is lost. And I'll refer you specifically to the footnote here. Aftermarket brands are more successful in providing a truly outstanding service experience, 29% versus 23%. We know from some additional research that we've seen that aftermarket service providers, perhaps because they're smaller and more closer to the customers, have a much higher customer satisfaction rating than the typical dealer, and certainly Napa's AutoPro has led for years this particular ranking, and that's an aftermarket brand, a warehouse distributor brand. So aftermarket players are more successful in providing a truly outstanding experience than dealers, and secondly, almost a quarter of dealer visits resulted in a score of 7 or less. 15 plus 9, 24%, clearly lost customers, only 18% for the aftermarket. So this is defining the market and the kind of challenges the dealer faces in this market. I'll wrap it up with this final slide, and that is dominant consumer priorities. These four priorities have been identified as core customer expectations in, that's the other study, the vehicle ownership experience satisfaction study, but these 4 have been identified as core expectations, and they've been fairly steady for a number of years now. Simplicity, openness, some people prefer to call that transparency, that we see what's going on and nothing is swept under the carpet, convenience, and speed. Now, note, it says nothing about fixing it right the first time or getting good value or any of these kind of core expectations. Why? Because you don't get any points for that anymore. If you want to be a serious contender, you at least deliver that. What the customer is telling us with these 4 core priorities: Look, this is a complicated world. Make it simple for me to own and operate my car. Give me prompt, convenient service when it's convenient for me, and do it in a way and to provide me with transparent feedback. And explanation of charges usually is among that priorities in transparent feedback, so I can decide for myself whether I'm getting good value. That is the new automotive service consumer. And it is in this environment that the OES sector has to thrive.